Welcome to week 4 of Air Transportation Seminar, and we are going over some of the material that we should be looking at with respect to week 4. We've been talking a lot about, the introduction to research. This is all under the course content, the brief concepts associated with research, some examples of research, as well as, the methodology of choosing your topics. And this was just broad brainstorming and coming up with some ideas or things that you might want to look at. And the technical terms would be either deductive or inductive reasoning for your topic, right? You're either looking and observing in the world of aviation and coming up with a topic, and we're working on defining the topic in a little bit more detail. And so now that we've gotten a little further along with the process and we're doing the literature review, or should have conducted the full literature review with other studies that have been done either related to the topic or the subject itself, the specific subject itself. It doesn't have to specifically be associated with aviation. It can be a little bit more broad in that sense, just to see what other people have done regarding similar topics, their setup, their research process, their methodology, things like that, will help us get a better idea of how we should do our study and move along. So right now we're in the lecture series, lecture 4. If we click and open that up, I've already opened up here. So in terms of the lecture, where we're at is defining the purpose statement in a little bit more detail, more clearly in that sense, technical terms being used, making sure it's formatted in a way that makes sense. And we're building up to where we're developing hypotheses that we think the outcomes may be, so that we can set up the statistics that we'll be doing for this study once we collect the data and analyze the data. With that, then we'll have to define the independent and dependent variables that might be associated with the study. And we're going to keep it relatively less complex in the sense that we're going to just keep it independent and dependent variables. We're not going to include anything that might be mediating or changing the results that we're not even considering in that sense. And we'll talk about some of these confounding variable options that might be out there that we may not be thinking of and that we have to kind of consider in a full-on research study. But for the purpose of this class, we'll look at IVs and DVs straightforward. In that sense, where we've come along in terms of the process, we've come up with a topic, and we've come along with respect to some literature review. And within the literature review, you should have come across potentially some theories that are based off of their research. Not every topic has to have a foundational theory, but the purpose of a theoretical framework, using a theory to help form a hypothesis, will allow you to model and create a stronger study. Basically, it's a framework, right? It's a building block of how you're going to explain your relationships between the variables in your model. Sometimes in some studies, we're actually theory forming, so we're actually watching the world and saying, hey, my theory is that this would happen. And a good example of this is, you probably have come across this maybe in another class, like in psychology or something along those lines, is Pavlov's law. And if you remember from that class, maybe whether it was in high school, elementary, or something along those lines, or in college, it was conditioning theory, right? The theory was that you could condition a dog. I'm simplifying the theory. You could condition the dog to come based off a bell, right? So you'd have a bell, and you'd ring the bell, and a dog would come along, right? This is my drawing of a dog. That's a terrible drawing of a dog, but that's the dog coming along because you have a treat, right? So you'd give the dog a treat. And each time you rang the bell, the dog would come and you would get a treat. And after a while, all you needed to do was, and they noticed that the dog would salivate because of the treat. And the theory is that all you needed to do after a while is just ring the bell, and the dog would start to salivate, right? And that's a theory, and that would be researched, and the hypothesis is that, if you rang the bell, the dog would salivate. You could use that framework for other behavioral studies in aviation, where if you can condition a pilot to do something based off a ringing of the bell, so to speak, would they produce a behavioral outset without the treat in that sense? So that's just an example to get your brain thinking in that sense. So having a theoretical framework kind of sets you up to say, okay, can I use a previous theory and use that in my current study, right? Will this theory work? And if I use that theory, then I can make hypotheses based on the theory, right? I can say that I believe if let's say I cause an alarm to go off, and the treat is not quite a treat in a aviation setting, we can base our hypothesis off this study. So let's say we have an alarm, and the alarm would then have a certain audio or audio-visual aid, right, to a problem for pilot, and the pilot had to do X, Y, Z, right? The theory, you could say, well, if I keep doing this for a while and have this specific alarm associated with the audio-visual aid to react to it, the pilot would do X, Y, Z. The theory would be, after a while, all I needed to do was give the alarm, and the pilot would act without the audio-visual aid to help with the problem. Just the alarm alone would cause the pilot to react in a certain way. And we kind of see that in some ways with pilot training, right? The stall horn is the alarm, and we talk about the various ways that we can, react to that in the sense that the pilot would then be ready for buffeting and, recover accordingly. So as soon as we hear that horn as pilots, we know now that the first thing we want to do is react by pushing the nose down and adding power, right, to recover from the stall. That's kind of related to a theoretical framework in that sense. And you can use that concepts to your study to say, well, what theories are out there? What behavioral theories are out there? What, theoretical frameworks out there that might be associated with my study. This one's a little hard because you need to have read a lot of different theories or have come across different theories that are out there in order to help you with your study. If you're looking at fatigue, I'm sure there's different theories that are out there. If you're looking at risk management, there's a theory called prospect theory by Levi, a famous psychologist that looked at how people would react based off a loss point of view versus a gain point of view. And that's really where the hazardous attitudes could come along with respect to aviation, and we used prospect theory for that. There's conditional behavioral theory, there's cognitive behavioral theory, there's a number of different theoretical frameworks that are out there for changing behaviors, for looking at fatigue, for looking at performance. There's locus of control theories that are out there that I've come across over time. And the tough thing with theoretical frameworks is that you just have to be exposed to it over time. And so depending on your study, I might be able to give you some feedback as to theoretical frameworks that I'm aware of and have come across. This is not a theory-based class. If you were doing more research or a more in-depth research course or a master's level course, we would look at various theories that are out there that we can use for various types of research. So you want to look at theoretical framework and then build upon that, because our goal is to come up with some hypotheses that we want to test, and we're not trying to prove. Proving is going to be very difficult to do in science. You don't prove things, you just you're strengthening your argument or not strengthening your argument, basically based off your hypotheses and statistical analysis. If the statistics point in a direction where it's strengthening your hypotheses or forming connections or relationships, showing that there's a strong relationship of X, Y, and Z to your hypotheses, that's a good thing, right? So we're not proving anything. We're just saying that there's a strong relationship, or it's pointing in this direction, things like that with respect to hypothesis forming. The next step is to define variables. So really what you're trying to do is define, what are we trying to measure? So when we talk about variables, we're really saying, okay, what are we trying to measure in our study, right? Or look at relationship measurements, right? What are we trying to see if there's a reaction to one thing versus the other, and what are we measuring? So you can have different types of variables. You can have continuous, discrete, or dichotomous. Dichotomous is easy. Male versus female is dichotomous. Old versus young, right? That can kind of maybe not be dichotomous in some ways. But that's just an example of the concepts of dichotomous, one or two things, right? So I have this little tree here that kind of talks about the different variables that you can come across. So if we go to dichotomous, gender is a good one. A pass or fail grade, full-time versus part-time employment status. There's two possible values only with a dichotomous variable. You can have a continuous variable. A continuous variable is just infinite number. So age and income can have different numbers. You can be 51 and a half. You can be 55, 60, 70, 80. I know there's a point where infinite number of age for a human might be the case, but you might be limited. But you can have age of, a business, an age of the airline, things like that, an age of an airplane. So that could be a continuous variable because there's no real set finite numbers. Income can also be, various numbers to cents, down to the cent. So that's why it's continuous. Whereas discrete, we're saying there's a set number of values, right? So the number of people, let's say, in a sample is a discrete value or variable in that sense. And so we've got this relationship of, well, what are our variables? Will our variables be dichotomous, discrete, or continuous? Then you want to talk about the IV versus the DV. So you'll hear this a lot, the independent variable versus the dependent variable. And so your job is to find out which one's which, and you want to clearly write it out to the reader, defining which is the independent and which one's dependent. And the best way I like to think about it is I draw a graph. So I say, okay, if I have the y-axis and the x-axis, right? So I have two axes here. And I want to look at two variables, right? Two variables. One, let's say, is age, and one is, let's say, weight. I don't know what they are yet. I haven't defined the dependent of or independent. We're just saying I want to look at, is there an effect of, does age affect weight in that sense? Do older people have higher weights? Things like that. And this is not exactly the best example, but it's just one example. I could also look at age and cholesterol, or age and body fat percentage, right? And we're looking at the average for a huge group of people, so we can just see what is the average changes as age changes in terms of those variables. So we'll look at weight in general, and I'm going to give an example, right? Where would I want to put the x-axis? Well, I want to put the x-axis on, I want to put age as the x-axis, right? Start at 0, and let's say I go up to 70 years old. I want to know what happens as the age changes. And so if I were to plot this, and I know that, on the y-axis we've got weight, right? and we say we've got from 0 weight to, let's say, we get up to 250 pounds, right? And we say, okay, well, what's the relationship? And this is just an example. It's not true in this sense scientifically. We were saying, okay, at a young age, we start at some weight, and as we get older, we get to some peak weight and kind of plateau over there, right? So if I were to look at this graph, I would state that my results infer or represent or display, they don't prove, they're just displaying or representing that as age increases, as you get older, you're going to get heavier. You're going to have more weight. You're going to be heavier the older you are. So if I looked at that, which variable is dependent on the other one? What changes because of the other? Well, if I look at it this way, I want to say that, well, I know that age is constant. It's not weight does not affect age, but age affects weight, right? So what is the effect of age on weight, right? And so this becomes the y. So the term y and x then is defined as what is the effect of age on weight. And the y-axis is always the dependent variable. So we can say that weight depends on age, right? Your weight will be dependent on age in this particular example. Okay? So the dependent variable is weight, the independent variable is age. Right? Age doesn't care about weight. Age is just going to be age, right? And so your weight is going to be dependent on age, on what age you are and what bracket you'll fall under. The same thing, let's do another example here. Let's say I want to look at gender of pilot versus performance in an IFR flight, IFR approach, let's say. That's just for example, right? So we have a dichotomous variable. And where would I want to put the gender axes? I would want to put it on the x-axis, right? I want to put it over here. And I'm going to have two bars, male versus female. And I'm going to have on the x-axis performance. How well do they do on this IFR flight? And so now we can say, okay, let's say we get our results from the study, and the performance bar for most of the females that I studied has this score, and the males have this score for the IFR approach, right, if we did it on a scale. So which one's the independent and dependent? So the independent, male versus female, are independent. You can measure male and female on different things, right? What is the effect of gender? If I listen to my sentence, what is the effect of gender? So that's on the x-axis on performance, right? So similar to over there. Age, what is the effect of age on weight? We're looking at what is the effect of gender on performance. And so based off that, I can say that the y-axis, remember I always say the y-axis is dependent variable. So the dependent variable, performance. So in this case, performance, the level of performance depends on whether you are the male or the female, right? So then therefore, gender is the independent variable. You see that? So what is the effect of gender of the pilot versus performance in an IFR approach? Performance becomes the dependent y variable, and the gender of the pilot is the x variable. So that is the two variables that we're looking at. So those are the two main variables. We'll look at independent versus dependent variable. So the dependent variable is a variable that is a consequence or is dependent on another variable. It is known as the outcome variable, right? So performance was the outcome variable. What is the outcome that we're trying to measure? What is the effect that we're trying to measure. So usually it's things like achievement, attitude, performance, things like that. The independent variable, like I said, is the X variable. What is the variable that is presumed to have an effect or influence on the dependent variable? So gender would have an effect. It depends on, performance will depend on whether you are a male or a female, right? So that's why the dependent variable is performance, and it depends on whether you are independently a male or a female, okay? And then there are other variables in a study that you've got to be aware of. We're not going to look at them so much in this class, but I just want you to be aware that there are extraneous variables, mediator variables, and moderator variables. All these variables are sometimes what we consider variables that we're not looking into. So an extraneous variables, or sometimes they're called a covariate variable, is a variable that is potentially affecting your results, but we are not really studying it. So the example I have is your math achievement might be not just dependent on whether you are male or female, let's say if you're looking at gender, but it might also include this term of attitudes, right? So you might be like, yeah, your attitude to math might be important, but I'm not measuring that for this study, right? We're just clearly separating out, let's say in this example, gender and math performance, looking at gender and math performance and not attitudes. And so in that case, we would say that attitudes towards math is an extraneous variable. It's something that we're not really going to consider, but it would have the potential to affect the results. A moderator variable is typically called also the confounding variable. It's a variable that's confounding the results that you don't really know it is, right? So if we're looking at the example I gave earlier about male versus female on IFR performance and an approach, a confounding variable might be something that we have no idea, it's overlooked or was not measured, and it's affecting my results. And that could be just the type of glass cockpit, right? So the glass cockpit that you use, maybe let's say in your study you're using a G1000, but if you used, let's say, steam gauges, maybe the males would be better with steam gauges because of some other reason that you don't know yet. And that's a confounding or moderator variable that we haven't been able to measure or figure out yet. So while we are saying that performance, we can say, based off my studies, our studies are showing that females perform better in an IFR approach than a male, right? That's the simple results. Those are the results based off my study and the statistics. However, we do have to consider that there might have been moderator variables. We used a G1000 suite for this study, and only a G1000 suite. We did not take a look into types of cockpit configurations to see if that played a role between male versus female. So that's what I mean by that. There's sometimes a mediator variable or an intervening variable that's working in the background, and you're measuring that too and seeing if that plays a role with respect to the dependent variable that you're measuring. So back to my example rather than the one that's on here. Let's say we're looking at, we are going to look at the type of cockpit configuration that you have, and you want to see if it's an intervening variable, a variable that's going to get in between your IV and DV. Or you could look at a better example would be noise. Let's say there's noise in the cockpit. That could be an intervening variable. The level of noise might be intervening your responsive performance. Maybe males will perform better than females with noise, or there might be an effect of noise with performance with respect to an IFR approach. So that's what it means by a mediator variable. And sometimes you want to include that in your research study and define that you would be measuring that in your study if you wanted to do that. We're going to just focus on measuring two variables, a dependent and independent variable for this study. So once we've got the variables, understanding the concepts of dependent, independent, moderator, and mediating variables, we want to then define your hypotheses. Your hypotheses is typically derived by theory if you've got that, but what you're trying to do is a tentative yet testable statement which predicts what you expect to find in your empirical data. So what does that mean? That's saying that you're stating an if-then statement, a directional or non-directional statement, null and alternative hypotheses. Those are the 3 types of hypotheses that you are going to study. And so what you want to do is say, okay, if I want to study, back to my example of males versus females on an IFR approach, right? And let me pull back up my iPad here. And let's say before we got these 2 results over here, we wanted to say, well, based off my literature review, it shows that females, let's say, are better at operating, in general, technical equipment than males are. I'm just making this up, right? So bear with me here. That's based off your literature review. So then your hypothesis would be, for your research, you're going to say, I hypothesize that there will be an effect on gender on performance. There is going to be an effect of gender on performance. That's my hypothesis. That's just a general, we would call that alternative hypothesis. A null hypothesis means that there's nothing that's going to happen. Your null hypothesis you do state typically and say, there is no effect of gender on performance. You're going to say it's equal. It doesn't matter if you're male or female, there's no effect. And you're testing against that, basically. If you believe that there is going to be an effect, that females will have a higher performance score than males based off your literature review, you state your null hypothesis saying that there will be no effect of gender on performance, and then you state your alternative saying that there is an effect of gender on performance, and you're basically checking the statistics to see if there is an effect between the 2, right? So that's basically what you do there. You could have a directional hypothesis. You're going to say that, so what I just said before was that there is an effect of female, but I didn't say it's going to be greater or lower, right? So I would make it clearer based off my literature that females will score. My next statement would be a 3rd hypothesis on top of the null and alternative, a directional hypothesis, that females will score higher than males. And now I'm going to statistically see if that is the case, if they are higher than males statistically, based off my study. So basically you'd have, I like to focus, we'll skip if-then statements. We'll just stick to directional, non-directional, null, and alternative. And your choice, the minimum you have to have is at least a null and alternative hypothesis. Your null is that there is no effect, and that's always generally stated in every research study, and you're basically usually trying to see if that isn't the case. You're trying to show that the alternative solution hypothesis is true based off your statistics. Then you could give a directional study and say that you can choose one of your variables and say that one's gonna either cause a larger change in the dependent variable or not. You can say females are gonna score higher than males. That's a directional hypothesis. If I go up to this one, so a null hypothesis would be age does not affect weight. The alternative hypotheses would be age does have an effect on weight. There is an effect of age on weight would be the alternative hypotheses. Your directional hypotheses would be as age increases, weight increases. That would be your directional hypotheses, all right? And so this is how we typically write hypotheses. Let me skip down here. I think that's going to be in a another slide here. We're going to talk about writing the hypotheses as well as the research question, and they're related. So once you've defined your hypotheses, you basically have defined your RQ. Some people would argue that you should do your RQ first, your research question first, and then define your hypotheses, but they're about the same concept. So we can do that or the other. So let's start off with RQs now that we've gotten somewhere with respect to understanding hypotheses versus the different types of hypotheses. So if we talk about RQs, what is the research questions? Well, the first step is we've defined our problem, right? What is our problem statement or purpose statement? Well, the problem statement is the overall statement as to what your purpose is. What are you trying to do here, right? You're trying to solve the research problem, right? So your research problem is, let's go here, purpose statement, problem statement. So it's more than a single sentence. So that's our first step before we get to RQs and hypotheses. We want to first define what is the problem statement or purpose statement. The problem statement is consisting of, when we say problem statement, I'm going to skip over this. The problem statement is a function of the purpose of your study, then the operational definitions, which you've kind of done already in some format, background, and that's part of your literature review in a much shorter statement there. Then you do your RQs typically, and then your hypotheses. And some people do it a little bit differently than others. So let's do a purpose statement. So for example, the purpose statement is the primary focus of a study. It should be very specific, narrow, define the variables that you're measuring and the testing that you're going to do, right? And so the purpose of this study is to do X, Y, Z. So if we go back up to here and we use this gender example on performance on an IFR approach, we're going to say that the purpose of the study is to examine the effects or the differences of gender of pilot on performance in an IFR approach, right? Then you'd say, well, I need to identify the independent and dependent variables. The independent variable in this study is gender of pilot, and the dependent variable of this of the study is the performance that the pilot scores in an IFR approach. Now that you've done the purpose statement and specifying the IV and DV, what you need to do is identify your operational definitions in a second here, because I just said gender of pilot. Well, what type of pilot? And then we also got to define what is performance on an IFR approach, right? And so if we continue on with this example here, we've defined the IVs and DVs, identify the participants to be studied and the research site at which it will be studied. So you could say, we're going to study genders of a pilot at UAA. The pilots that we're going to be using are pilots from UAA, for example. So there you go. That makes it a little bit easier. Or if you wanted to do it broader, let's say we're going to study the pilots in Alaska that are available in Alaska. If you were doing a survey research where you're sending out a survey measurement tool, you could define your population based off how you're going to disseminate that survey and collect that, right? And then what you want to be able to do is, once you've got that purpose statement, your operational definition, now that you've defined the IV and DV, you want to define for this study. Here is just giving you an example in this paragraph, but I'm going to use mine on this iPad right here. So for this study, gender of pilot is defined as gender of a licensed private instrument or commercial rated pilot, right? That could be your definition for gender of pilot. And then you can define performance in an IFR approach is defined as the score given in an IFR approach using an application that measures the GPS location of the pilot in a simulated IFR approach, comparing it to the perfect approach associated with the GPS location points of where the airplane should be. So depending on how you want to define it is up to you. You're just defining it specifically to meet the clarity of what do you mean by that variable so that someone else could replicate that. And then your background is really to introduce the topic. You want to make me interested in this topic, and that could be just based off of your literature review and your experience. So you could say, and you want to include what's called a narrative hook, right? So you want to say something along the lines of, let's use gender of pilot. So the number of women in aviation has been slowly growing, but has been historically low. There has been arguments that gender plays a role in performance and that males are better pilots than females. I'm, again, making this up, so bear with me here. And so that would be a narrative hook. You'd be like, okay, I'm kind of interested to see where you're going with this, right? And then you would say, studies have shown, and then you would list some of your previous literature review. Studies have shown that, gender does play a role in performance with technical subjects, and list a couple examples. A study that examined, 100 technicians in a hospital showed that females scored higher than males in this specific exercise. And that would just be a way to kind of include some statistical data, some need for the research. You're providing some need, saying that, this study is to broaden the literature on gender, disparity in the aviation workforce. And we can see that performance does play a role with respect to gender, and that, that gender is not an issue in terms of performance, and that we should open the door for more opportunities for other pilots to come into the aviation industry. So that could be one way to justify and presenting your research problem, and that's really what you're trying to do there. Then once you've done the problem statement, what you want to do is be able to define your research questions. So your research questions, step 2 here is your RQs. So once you've got your purpose study, you're just basically rewriting your purpose statement, right? And so if your study is, my purpose is to examine the effect, let's say, of gender on pilot performance, right, is the overall purpose. Your RQ is going to be stated in a way where it says, is there an effect of gender on pilot performance? And depending on how many RQs you want to study, you can expand on that. It depends on how many RQs you want to have. You can say, is there an effect of gender on pilot performance? Is there a directional effect? Is there a gender that performs better than the other in terms of pilot performance? You can also look at it in terms of, is there a relationship? If you're looking at a mediator variable, is there a mediator variable in this study? So that could be an RQ, but we're going to keep it simple and keep it to 1 or 2 RQs for this study here. So if I said my RQ is there an effect of gender on pilot performance? Step 3, my hypothesis. You typically write your hypothesis as the null, the alternative, and in some cases directional, right? So if I gave you 3 examples, we write it H subscript 0, so small 0 is the null hypothesis. This would be the alternative hypothesis, and this could be a directional hypothesis, okay? So your null hypothesis could be, based off my RQ, now I can have 3 hypotheses. Based off 1 RQ, I have 3 hypotheses, right? My null hypothesis would be, there is no statistical effect or statistical difference between gender and performance, okay? H subscript 1 is the alternative. There is a statistical. It's pretty broad, but we don't know which direction it's going to go. This is non-directional. It's a null alternative hypothesis. There is a statistical difference between gender and performance, right? Or pilot performance. You can define that as you wish. Then your directional hypothesis could be, females score higher in pilot performance than males. That'd be a directional hypothesis. And basically your study, your setup for the methodology, your statistical analysis will be to examine these hypotheses and see if there is some relationship according to your null, alternative, or directional. Are you able to accept the null or, or accept the alternative? Which one are you going to accept out of the hypotheses? And then is your directional hypotheses true or not true based off your statistical analysis? So that kind of wraps up what we want to do for this week. Is basically you are defining in a little bit more detail now that you've got some knowledge, your purpose statement, your purpose statement in quite a bit of detail, your hypotheses, as well as your RQs with respect to your study that you're coming up with, right? So if you go back to Blackboard and go to your week 4, I'm going to be uploading another file here that's called 5 out of 10 points. And your 5 out of 10 points is basically to lead you to the 10 points document that I have for quantitative research proposals. You're basically, should be filling up some of this already, and this will have your purpose statement as well as your RQ, as well as your research question, as well as your hypotheses and variables. So those are your 5 out of the 10. It's read out after 5 because I don't want you to do that. That's as far as we're going to go for the time being. So I want you to be able to create your broad topic. You should have done that already, so that should be pretty easy. You should have your literature review. I wanted a condensed version of your literature review into this document. It can be, 1 or 2 pages down of this column here. You can expand that. Write what relevant information those 3 articles contain regarding your research. So write how they are related to your research now. So it should be correlated to your research somehow. And then this problem statement really also, I want that to be your, this has to include your, like I said in the lecture, your purpose, your operational definitions, your background, why you're doing it and what it's going to do, your implications to study. And then we'll leave it at that because the next step, question 4, is your research questions and then your hypotheses and your variables. So I want to make sure that you have all of that in your 5-point document. All right, good luck.